Hello everyone, my name is Juliana Zinchenko and welcome back to my YouTube channel. On this channel, you will find a ton of sewing and fashion content, from sewing tutorials to fashion video essays. In today's video, I will be showing you how to sew a fancy silk robe. To go along with the sewing tutorial, I have a sewing pattern for you guys. It is called the Getting Ready Robe and it is available on my Etsy shop. I will have that linked below. I am a huge fan of a nice fancy robe. It just makes me feel so womanly. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's something about growing up on Victoria's Secret. I don't know, but it just makes me feel so elegant and girly and more like put together while I'm getting ready. It just feels a little bit like I'm romanticizing my life and not needing an excuse to wear something fancy or luxurious. This pattern can also be used for bridal parties. I think it's so cute when bachelorette parties are all in fancy robes and are getting ready together for the bride's big day. It's giving womanhood. Without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. But don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to know when we have our next sewing lesson. Like, share, comment, and don't forget to follow me on other platforms such as Instagram and TikTok. All right, first let's go over what we're going to need. We're gonna need shears, which are fabric scissors, polyester thread, fabric chalk, pins, pinking shears, fabric, an iron, and a clear ruler is optional, but it really helps, and a loop turner. The first thing you're gonna do is grab your pattern pieces. I went with the A0 print file, so I printed mine at FedEx. And you're gonna see this double arrow on the pattern pieces. This arrow indicates where the warp grain line is. And basically it is there so that you know which direction to place your pattern. All you have to do is make sure that the warp grain line arrow is parallel to the selvage edge of your fabric. And if you don't know what the selvage edge is, it is just the finished edge of your fabric. Next, I want to go over notches. If you're unfamiliar with notches, they basically just serve as a guideline. When you see a triangle on the edge of your pattern, it's called a notch. To use them, you want to cut in the opposite direction to mirror the notch. This creates reference points on your pieces. In this project, the only pattern piece with notches is the front bodice. All right, before we get started, I want to mention that steps 1 and 7 are optional. If you don't care for belt loops, a hanger loop, and the waist tie that goes on the inside of the robe to keep your robe together while it's on, then you can start at step 8. So what you want to do is take your belt loops, your hanger loop, and your waist ties, and you're going to fold them right sides together horizontally. Then you're going to iron it down. I like to iron it down because it makes sewing it much easier in my opinion. I also almost always am using a tailor's clapper when I'm ironing. It makes everything super flat and crisp. Next, you're going to sew along the raw edge using a straight stitch, and the seam allowance for this whole project is 1/2 inch. And the seam allowance is included in all of the pattern pieces. No matter how much experience you have in sewing, drawing the seam allowance line is always helpful. I usually will use the guidelines on the throat plate, but sometimes I like to go the extra mile and also draw the seam allowance line. Now, when you start sewing, make sure that your top thread is underneath your presser foot and that both of the threads are going towards the back of your machine. These are the guidelines I was talking about, so I will just pick a guideline on the throat plate, align my raw edge with that guideline, and then position my needle so that it is in line with the seam allowance line that I drew. Also, a little tip, I like to start sewing about 1/8 inch from the edge because sometimes when you start right at the beginning of your fabric, it can be sucked in by this hole in the sewing machine. Also, I normally would choose a thread color that matches the garment, but for the sake of this video, so you guys can see, I'm using white. And voila, this is what it should look like when you're all finished. We have the back stitches at the end. Don't forget to clip your loose threads at the end. And then the next thing that we're going to do is grab our pinking shears and cut the seam allowance in half. So a little fun fact about fabric is that when you cut on the bias, which is the 45-degree angle to the selvage edge, your fabric doesn't fray. So basically, pinking shears create a ton of tiny cuts along the bias. Next, we're going to take our loop turner so that we can take our pieces and turn them right side out. At the end of the loop turner, you will see there's this little pick right here. And what you want to do is take your loop turner and put it through your strap or your belt loop. And then you want to put that pick through the fabric. You want to make sure that it's about 1/4 inch from the edge. And then when you push your fabric up, you see that the pick kind of locks that fabric in there. And then what you want to do is use your fingers to keep pushing that strap up, and then the end of the loop turner will grab your fabric so that it pulls it through itself, and then you eventually will have a strap that is right side out. Repeat this process for all of the other pieces. Next, we're going to iron down all of these pieces so that they're nice and crispy. What I like to do is use my fingers to shimmy the fabric so that it gets right up to that seam, and then iron it down. And then I go in with a tailor's clapper, of course. See how flat that is? It just looks so nice when you use a tailor's clapper. Next, we need to finish off the ends of the waist ties, and we will need to do this on one end because the other end of the tie will go into a seam. So how we do this is we're going to take our loop turner again and put it through the strap, and we're going to do the same thing as we did when we turned it right side out, but this time you're just going to use it to tuck in a little bit of fabric, and then you're going to unhook it and then take the loop turner out. And then you're going to sew along that edge. Sometimes when you're working with a tiny piece of fabric like this, it can be hard to put it through the sewing machine. So I iron it first because that really helps. And then also increasing your stitch length can help as well. But if you're having trouble with the sewing machine for this step, you can always do this step by hand. I think that would be much easier. Here is another option for finishing off the strap. You can clip the end with pinking shears and then fold it over one more time and then sew along the edge. If it's hard to get through the sewing machine, you can sew it by hand. I highly recommend doing stay stitches on the curved areas of your bodice pieces. These parts are cut along the bias, so they have a tendency to stretch out, and we don't want our pieces to get distorted because then when we go to sew, we want our pieces to all match perfectly. A stay stitch is just a straight stitch on a single layer of fabric, and what you want to do is you want to decrease your stitch length to about 2.0. You can do it lower than that too, but I usually like to do 2.0. For the robe I'm making in this tutorial, I decided not to do a stay stitch. All right, let's get into sewing the bodice pieces together. You want to take your back and front pieces and put them right sides together. And then we're going to sew along the shoulder line using a straight stitch. And then you're going to finish off the raw edge of the seam allowance, either using a serger or a stitch on the sewing machine that mimics a serged stitch. I have a couple options for you on the left of the screen. And then I'm going to also draw the seam allowance for this part. Another tip when working with silky fabrics is to use a ton of pins. Silky fabrics are constantly moving around. It's definitely a more challenging fabric type, so using a lot of pins will help you. Another tip is to test out everything on a scrap piece of fabric before you start your project. And then another tip is to make sure that your garment is fully on the table and that it's not hanging off of it, because if it's hanging off of the table, it will pull and stretch out the fabric. So same thing with the straps. I'm going to find a guideline on my throat plate and align my fabric with that line. And then I'm going to position my needle so that it's in line with the seam allowance line. Do not be fooled by my sped up clips. I take my time when I'm sewing, and so should you. This is what it will look like when you're all finished. And then I'm going to switch over to my serger, and again, I'm going to practice on a scrap piece of fabric before I go in with my robe. This is what it should look like when you're all finished. Then what I'm going to do is iron down the 2 seams we just sewed. I like to iron so that the seam allowance is going towards the back of the garment. I like to iron from the inside first and then also do the outside. Make sure that your iron is set to the appropriate setting for your fabric, or you can use a press cloth and put that over your fabric while you're ironing so that your fabric is protected. Then you're going to put your pieces back to being right sides together, and this is the step where we're going to add in the belt loops and one of the waist ties. If you decided not to do these, you can just skip this step. As you can see here, I have the belt loop sandwiched in between the front and the back bodice. And then sew where I've indicated. You also want to make sure that you backstitch at the waist tie just to make it extra secure, because that area will experience a lot of tugging. I know I keep recommending to draw the seam allowance, but I really recommend it when you are about to sew a corner or a curved area. Having a line to follow when you're doing a curve makes it much easier. When you reach the curved area, you want to make sure that the edge of your fabric stays along that guideline along the throat plate as you're doing the curve. You want to use your hands to swing it around gently. And then, like I said, when I hit the waist tie, I do a back stitch. Again, I'm going to make sure my garment is fully on the table and not hanging off of it as I finish off the seam allowance using my serger. And while I'm doing the seam allowance part, I actually try to straighten out the curved part. I think it makes it much easier to finish off the seam allowance this way. This is what it will look like when you're all finished, and then you want to press the seam flat. For the underarm section, I highly recommend using a tailor's ham. See, look how nice and crispy our seam looks now. Moving on to step 12, we're going to take our 2 sleeve trims and we're going to fold them in half vertically, right sides together, and then we're going to sew along that raw edge. Take your pinking shears and cut the seam allowance in half. Then what we're going to do is press the seam flat. You can either press the seam allowance to one side or you can open it up and press it down like I am right here. It just kind of depends if you have enough fabric to open it up. Then we're going to fold our pieces in half horizontally and press them flat. I like to pin at the seam while I'm pressing the sleeve trim flat so that everything stays in place and where it should be. And voila, this is what they will look like when you're finished. Next, we're going to take our sleeve trim and align it with the end of the sleeve. What you want to do is line up the seam on the sleeve trim with the bottom seam of the sleeve. This way it just looks nicer. You won't see the seam from the top of the sleeve. And what you're going to do is put the end of your sleeve inside the sleeve trim so that the raw edges are all lined up, and then you're just going to sew all the way around. If you did it correctly, you should be sewing through 3 layers of fabric. Here I am lining up the seams. And voila, this is what it should look like when you're all finished. And don't forget to tie off the loose threads. I also want to mention, if you notice a slight gather at the end of your stitch, it may be caused by the presser foot stretching the top layer of your fabric. This is why you won't see any gathering on the opposite side. You're only stretching the top layer. While it's not a major issue, it's just something to be aware of. Silky fabric can shift a lot while you're cutting, touching, or sewing it. Some sewing machines let you adjust the presser foot pressure to help with this. This is why I stress using a ton of pins, or you can even go in with a basting stitch. Next, we're going to press our sleeve trim. I also want to mention that you can top stitch the collar and the sleeve trim. I think it gives a very luxurious look, but sometimes I decide not to. So it's all up to you and what you prefer. If you do decide to top stitch, I do recommend increasing your stitch length because I think it gives a more professional, high quality look. Next, we're going to take out our collar pieces and we're going to place them on top of each other, right sides together. And then you're going to sew at the end along the raw edge. All right, by now y'all know the drill. Trim the loose threads and cut the seam allowance in half using pinking shears, and then press the seam flat. Then you're going to fold the collar wrong sides together and iron it down. And just like with the sleeve trim, I have that middle seam pinned together while I iron. Next, you're going to line up the raw edge of the collar with the raw edge of the bodice. And this is the step where we put in the hanger loop and the other waist tie if you decided to use these. For this waist tie, if you were to be wearing the robe, it will be on your left side. Sew where I have indicated and then finish off the seam allowance with a serger. Also, don't forget to backstitch at the waist tie and the hanger loop at the back of the neck because these areas will experience a lot of tugging. The part around the back of the neck is probably the most challenging part of this project. You are easing a straight piece onto a curved piece, so really take your time at this part and watch out for any gathering that might occur. I'll keep checking underneath my fabric every few stitches to make sure that there's no pleats as well. As I'm coming up on the hanger loop here, I'm going to make sure I backstitch. I try to keep the curved shape of the back of the neck as I'm sewing it, so that as I'm sewing it's staying nice and smooth and that there's no gathering or pleats that are happening, and I even keep checking underneath. I want to mention a few things that have to do with the collar and the bottom of the robe. As you can see here, I have the collar pinned to the bottom of the robe, and it looks as though the collar is too short for the robe. But that is not the case. It is just because I have it pinned, and when you're working with silky fabrics like this, even pinning will gather the fabric a little bit, so it will appear as though it's shorter. But don't worry, when you get to sewing, it should fit perfectly. Now, in some cases, you might notice that your collar is a bit longer than the bottom of the robe. If this happens to you, it means there is slight gathering somewhere along the collar. It usually happens around the back of the neckline. Because you are attaching a straight piece to a curved piece, gathering is more likely to happen. Because the garment is gathered, it shrinked it a little bit, and that is why sometimes you will see that your collar is sometimes longer than the bodice. This is not a huge deal majority of the time since it's such a slight gather you can't tell from the outside of the garment, so I usually will just chop off the excess fabric and continue on to hemming. Something that you can do to help prevent this is place 2 pins at the bottom of the collar on both sides, and then from there start pinning up towards the back of the neckline. As you can see here for this robe, the collar matched up perfectly, and as you can see, the back neckline has no gathering. So the ultimate goal is to have your robe look like this, but again, it's no big deal if the collar ends up being a little longer, just chop off the extra fabric. All right, this is what it's gonna look like when you're all finished. We have our hanger loop at the back of the neck and the waist tie along the collar. Next, we're gonna iron down the collar. To iron down the curves around the neck, I'm going to use a tailor's ham. Alright, we are almost finished. All we have to do is hem the bottom. What you want to do is draw 2 lines using fabric chalk and a clear ruler. The first line will be 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge, and the second line will be 3/4 of an inch from that first line. So altogether, it should be 1 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. And you want to make sure you're drawing these lines on the right side of the fabric. Most fabric markers and fabric chalk are washable, but make sure you test it out on your fabric. Next, what we're going to do is fold at that first line and iron it down, and then you're going to fold at the second line and iron it down. This is what it should look like when you are all finished. 1 fold and then another fold. Next, using a straight stitch, you want to sew as close as you can to the edge, but not so close that your needle doesn't catch the fabric. Y'all know the drill. Make sure you have that top thread underneath your presser foot and both threads are going towards the back. And then I'm going to start sewing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge so that my fabric doesn't get all caught up in the machine when I start sewing. I'm going to use the presser foot as a guide and align the edge of it to the edge of my fabric so that I keep a nice straight line. And voila, that is what it should look like when you're all finished. And then I go in and iron it down one more time to make sure it's nice and flat. All right, we're done with the robe, but the last thing we have to do is make the belt. What you want to do is take your 2 belt pieces and put them right sides together and then sew along the straight raw edge. Cut the seam allowance in half using pinking shears and then iron it down. Next, you're gonna fold your belt horizontally, right sides together. Then we're going to sew along the raw edge. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitch. And then make sure to leave an opening near the center. I like to make mine about 1.5 inches to 2 inches. And then also make sure you backstitch around that opening so that it doesn't unravel. Like I said, I especially like to draw the seam allowance when I'm sewing corners or curved edges. So I highly recommend it for this step. All right, let's go over how to sew a perfect corner. So what you want to do is when you get up to the point of the corner, you're going to make sure that your needle is lowered into the fabric. Then you're going to lift up your presser foot, swing your fabric around to realign it, lower your presser foot, and continue sewing. See, we got that perfect corner there. Then we're going to cut the seam allowance in half using pinking shears. And near the corners, I like to cut as close as I can, but not too close, so that when you turn this belt right side out, those corners will be nice and sharp. And you won't have fabric near that corner that's going to make it bulky. Then we're going to use that opening to turn our belt right side out. And then I'll go in with a point turner for the corners. Another thing I like to do to make my corners extra sharp is I'll go in with a pin and try to kind of shimmy that fabric so that I get a very pointed corner. But if you decide to do that, have a light hand because you are going in with a pin. You don't want to rip your fabric or ruin anything. All right, we are almost finished. The last thing we have to do is top stitch to close that opening. I like to use my presser foot as a guide, so I'm just going to align the edge of my belt to the edge of my presser foot, and then I'm going to sew as close as I can to the edge, but not so close that my needle doesn't catch the fabric. This is what it should look like when you are all finished. And voila, we are done. You just sewed your own getting ready robe. All right, that is it for the getting ready robe sewing tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment below, or you can DM me on Instagram at Juliana Zinchenko. I'm your sewing teacher. I'm here to help you, so don't hesitate to reach out. Love you.